keeping you entertained during Q&A. Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. David J. Fitzpatrick. Received a BS from the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1978, then served for the next 14 years on active duty as an Army artillery officer at installations around the United States, in the Federated Republic of Germany, and in Korea. He went on to receive his master's from the University of Michigan in 1988 and his PhD from UM in 1996. He has taught at Washtenaw Community. He has taught at UM, United States Military Academy, Oakland University, at the University of Michigan. He has received a long list of teaching and scholarship awards from various American groups and organizations. He concentrates his research on military policy and on civil-military relations in the United States after the Civil War. His most recent book is Emory Upton, Misunderstood Reformer, which came out from Oklahoma University Press in 2017. You have its front cover on your screen. And that's the subject of Dr. Fitzpatrick's talk today. So, please help me welcome David Fitzpatrick to our podium.
Beat Navy. I will be there again this year. I want to thank Kevin and the Clements Library for inviting me to speak today. And I also want to thank, before I get started, two people who are responsible for me being here. You'll judge whether or not that's a good thing. But this wouldn't have happened without their help. One is someone who couldn't make it today, the longtime former director of the Clements Library, John Dan. John reached out to the Upton Foundation and secured a very significant grant that funded my research, and that would not have happened, or I would not have gotten done, certainly not as quickly as I did without his help. And the other person, and really people, because they are a team, I want to thank, are John and Arlene Shy. John was my academic advisor when I first got to the University of Michigan as a U.S. Army captain, not having a clue what graduate education in history meant and how it worked, and he turned me into something of a historian. And Arlene was a wonderful partner, still is a wonderful partner to him. But they both accepted my family. My kids love them, and I very much appreciate all the support both of you have given me over these last 30 years, and that's kind of awful. So anyway, so I'm here to talk about Emory Upton, and I'll take away one question that's almost certainly going to be asked: why did I pick Upton? And I can thank John for that. John contacted me when I was still in the active duty Army. Was coming back here to finish my PhD. I hadn't picked a dissertation. He called me up. I was in Germany at the time. Said, "Have you chosen a dissertation topic?" And I said, "Not really." And he said, "Well, I know you want to do something on naval history," which I did. But there's $5,000 at the Clements Library to be used for research on Emory Upton, and $5,000 will fund a lot of research trips, and you don't want to sell your soul for $5,000, but if you think Upton is interesting and there's something to do with Upton, you ought to consider it. So when I got back here to Ann Arbor, I took a look at Upton. He was not a mystery to me. I knew who he was, but I came to the conclusion that there was some serious work to be done there. And so this started for $5,000. I was here for a year, working partially on getting ready for my preliminary exams, but also really starting to doing my research on Upton, looking at published sources, and the U of M library was marvelous. And I'd done a lot of research on Upton. Before the next summer, I went on my first research trip. And I was going to go to Batavia, New York, which is where he was born. County historian has a significant Upton collection. And I was going to go to West Point, New York, where he went to school as I did, to go to their special collections and to their archives and look at the paperwork there. And then finally to the winter tour manuscripts down in Wilmington, Delaware, where the DuPont papers are, because one of the DuPonts was his West Point classmate, and they stayed in touch for the rest of his life. And so that was my plan. And this is back in the day before email and the internet was the thing. So you actually had to pick up the phone, and I called the historian in Batavia and said, I'm coming. These are the dates I'd like to be there. Will you be open? And yeah, we'll be open. And she said to me, she said, so you're researching Emory Upton? And I said, yes, I am. And she said, have you seen his handwriting? And I said, no, I haven't. And she said, and I kid you not, maybe you ought to pick a different topic. That's one of the letters that's in Batavia, and let me tell you, that's one of the better ones. It was like learning to read Greek. I had to teach myself how to read his handwriting, and it was an experience. Well, what I want to do here, I want to focus on the subtitle and to give you a sense of why I call him the misunderstood reformer. But just in case you're not really aware of who he was and what he did, let me quickly run through his life, what his career was, and then focus on that misunderstood reformer. As I said, he was born in Batavia, New York, which is about 40 miles east of Buffalo on the New York Thruway in 1839. That district, that area was known as the burnt-over district of the Second Great Awakening. All the religious upheaval there. His parents were devout Methodists. They were teetotalers. They were abolitionists. The Upton home was routinely a stop on the Underground Railroad. He was the ninth of 13 children. And very early on, he announced his desire to go to West Point. He tried to get an appointment when he was but 15 years old. Congressman said, no, you're not ready. His father sent him to Oberlin, which at that point in time, the part of Oberlin he went to was really best understood as a preparatory school. Spent a year at Oberlin and all that was going on at Oberlin with the abolitionist movement. Then applied to the congressman again in 1856, and he got in as a not yet 17-year-old boy. He went to West Point that summer, and one of his sisters wrote him a letter, which I've not seen that letter. I've seen Upton's reply. And that letter, she must have asked him, why are you going to West Point? What would motivate you to go there? And this is what he wrote. If I should graduate, $1 million would not place me in the position I would then occupy had I not received the appointment. My reasons are hidden, but set it down, and he underlines down, set it down. If I should graduate and there should be a civil war, the North might be somewhat benefited by me. This is the summer of 1856. This is a not yet 17-year-old boy. He's gone to West Point to be on a crusade. He sees what's coming. Now, other people, of course, did too. He graduated in May of 1861. His class was the last of a brief experiment West Point ran in 5-year classes. The Civil War came, and they graduated the class of 1862 early, so they graduated in June of 61, and that's the 61 class that, by the way, has George Custer in it. Upton graduated the month before in May. He served at first Bull Run as a general's aide, then was assigned to artillery units. He served on the Peninsular Campaign and at Antietam, that's a mouthful, in the artillery. He realized that the quick way to promotion was not in the regular Army, that was slow, that the way to get promoted was to get in the volunteers, to get some sort of volunteer commission. He finagled himself then, he went from first lieutenant in the artillery, finagled himself a commission in the volunteers. He was the colonel of the 121st New York Volunteer Infantry, its regimental commander. He led the 121st New York at the Battle of Fredericksburg, at the Battle of Chancellorsville, and commanded it up to right in the middle of the Battle of Gettysburg, at which point he was appointed to brigade command. In late 1863, he led that brigade in a little-known battle. The Battle of Rappahannock Station happened in November of 1863. You may not know about it, but George Gordon Meade and the other generals in the Army recognized it. Upton's brigade captured a couple of Confederate redoubts, along with 1,000 soldiers and several thousand stand of arms, with very few casualties. This is Upton starting to be noticed by the command structure of the United States Army. In the 1864 campaign, he distinguished himself, first at the Battle of the Wilderness, but then, most importantly, at the Battle of Spotsylvania, where on the 10th of May, he led his reinforced brigade. His brigade had 3 regiments assigned to it. He had 9 more regiments added to his brigade. This brigade really is best understood as a big division at this point in time. A 12-regiment attack across open ground at the base of what comes to be known as the Mule Shoe. It's a spectacular success. He gets into the Confederate position, and it's a well-dug-in position, abattis, log barriers, the whole 9 yards. He gets into the Confederate position with little to no casualties. Unfortunately, the division that was supposed to support him, Gershom-Mott, didn't. Upton's brigade was hung out to dry. They eventually had to retreat out of that position, and it was the retreat that cost his brigade dearly. As the so-called Overland Campaign went on, he commanded his brigade at Cold Harbor, was initially present at the Siege of Petersburg, but then when the Confederate Army invaded the North and threatened Washington, D.C., this is Jubal Early's invasion of the North, Grant sent the corps that Upton was assigned to up to defend Washington, D.C. That corps went up there, and it eventually got involved in the Shenandoah Valley Campaign under Phil Sheridan. And at the battle of 3rd Winchester, sometimes known as Opequon Creek, Upton's brigade, now this map doesn't quite capture it, but Upton's brigade, and it's not Emory, there was a General Emory, but here's Upton down here. Upton's brigade played a large role in stemming a Confederate assault that threatened to break the Union Army apart. And then when Upton's division commander, David Russell, got killed, Upton briefly became the division commander, and then he took a 12-pound solid iron cannonball in the butt. It tore out a chunk of his flesh. He was carried off the battlefield, sent home to recuperate for a couple of months. In December, he was sent out west, where he took command of a cavalry division, and that cavalry division was a part of Wilson's raid into Alabama and Georgia at the end of the war. And if you're not familiar with Wilson's raid, think Sherman's march on horseback. It's what it was. So here's a gentleman who commanded artillery at the beginning of the war, infantry for most of the war, cavalry at the end of the war. It's a very unique experience he had. After the war, he had assignments throughout the Reconstruction South. He also set out to revise the Army's infantry tactics. The infantry tactics were broken. Everybody knew it. The tactics didn't reflect the firepower of new weapons. He revised the Army's infantry tactics, and those revisions were accepted. And he married a young woman, Emily Martin of Auburn, New York, a very well-connected political family. She was not well when they married. I suspect she had tuberculosis. There's no mention of tuberculosis or consumption, but it sure sounds like she had tuberculosis. And she died a little bit more than 2 years after their marriage. In 1870, shortly after Emily's death, he was assigned to West Point, New York, where he was made the commandant of cadets, that is, the officer in charge of the Corps of Cadets, not its academic regimen, but in charge of the Corps and its military training. He served as commandant for 5 years, and while he was there, he and some of his friends rewrote all of the Army's tactics manuals. Its artillery manual, its infantry manual, its cavalry manual, and they were adopted. And those manuals will be the Army's tactics manuals for the next 20 years. When he left West Point, the commanding general of the Army, William Tecumseh Sherman, sent him and 2 other officers on an around-the-world trip. More on that later. The purpose of the trip being to see what other armies of the world were doing and what the United States might learn from them. He came back to the United States in late 1876. He was assigned then to be the superintendent of instruction at Fort Monroe, Virginia, which is where the artillery school was. He was there until 1880 when he got promoted to colonel. And I should say his promotions during the Civil War were breveted. He went from colonel to brigadier general to major general, but when the war ended, he kicked back to being a major and then working his way back up. So here in 1880, he's appointed the colonel of the 4th Artillery, which was stationed in the Presidio of San Francisco. He transferred out to San Francisco just before Christmas, and tragically, in March of 1881, he committed suicide. Historians have grappled with Emory Upton for a century. The first truly serious work on Upton was written by one of the giants of military history, a gentleman named Russell Weigley. This book really isn't about Upton. It's Towards an American Army is Weigley's effort to figure out the ideas that percolated through the Army about what its organization ought to be like and how it ought to train and who ought to lead it. And he, in his writings here in this book, and this was one of his first books, and in other things Weigley wrote, he was hypercritical of Upton. He found him to be a militarist. He found him to be a Prussian wannabe, trying to recreate Prussian militarism in America. And to quote him, I will say, and John, this answers your question, by the way. To quote him, Upton, he says, quote, ended in deep pessimism. And he did so in part because he failed to acknowledge that military policy must reflect the general policy of the nation, and more than that, reflect the general spirit of the nation. Because Upton never really attempted to understand the civilian view of military policy, he failed utterly to formulate a policy in harmony with the American national genius. Upton was a Prussian militarist, or a wannabe Prussian militarist, who didn't understand the role of the military in American society. Weigley's book was echoed by the only other serious biography of Upton before mine. This is Stephen Ambrose's Upton in the Army. This was Stephen Ambrose's doctoral dissertation. The doctoral dissertation he defended, I believe, in 63, and then LSU Press published it completely unchanged, word for word, the following year. And Ambrose simply ratified Weigley's findings. And so when John suggested to me that I look at Upton, these were the two books I went to, and then more broadly in the literature, how Upton was dealt with. And I got to be honest with you, I mean, these two people at the time were giants. Ambrose's reputation has since slid downhill a little bit, maybe a lot. But at the time they were giants. Weigley still is. He passed away here a few years ago. And so I had no doubt, starting my research, that I was going to find that he was a Prussian militarist, because how could these guys be wrong? My goal then was to write a fuller biography than Ambrose wrote, because it's thin. I mean, it's not only thin, but it's thin. It leaves you asking more questions about the man than are answered. And I wanted to answer those questions. And the primary one was how does this devoutly Methodist, anti-slavery, anti-aristocratic farm boy from upstate New York transform into being a Prussian militarist? What happens when how does that take place? And my surprising conclusion, I mean, I couldn't have been more surprised as I worked at it, was they were wrong. I mean, and they were wildly wrong. It wasn't even a close call. Upton believed he was creating a military system that worked within the tradition of the American Republic, within American democratic traditions, a system that he knew worked because he'd seen it work in the Civil War, and he believed he was defending Republican traditions, little r, Republican traditions, not threatening them. At the heart of the charge that he was a Prussian militarist, was this around-the-world trip that he took. And went with two other officers. One of the other officers was a University of Michigan graduate. His papers are here on campus. The trip began in San Francisco. They sailed west to Japan, then to China, then briefly to Singapore, to India. They spent almost 3 months in India. Their plan from India was to travel overland through Afghanistan to Russia. The British said, yeah, we don't think that's a very good idea. You probably ought to try a different route. And so they hopped on a ship and sailed to what was then Persia, today Iran, traveled overland through Iran to briefly into Russia, then into Turkey, hopped on a ship to Italy, Italy to obviously going overland, but stopping to see the Italian army, then to Russia, then to Prussia, Germany, briefly in Germany because they weren't being allowed to see what he wanted to see. They went to Austria. They went then down to the Balkans to briefly observe the ongoing Serbo-Turkish War. Back then to Germany, where they were allowed to see a few things, to France, to Britain, back home, 18-month trip. Historians, Weigley and Ambrose, have alleged that Upton was heavily influenced by what he saw in the German army. And he was, let there be no doubt. He absolutely was. What they've missed is what he took away from the Indian army. He was there for 3 months. He was there for 3 months for a reason. He was in Germany for a few weeks. If you read the book, I would tell you, you probably don't want to read it unless you want to go to sleep. But he produced a book, The Armies of Asia and Europe, as a report of this trip. His report on the Indian Army is by far and away the largest chapter of this book. No other army's close. And it's very clear that he took away lessons from the Indian Army. And you're wondering, well, what could it be? Well, it was an Indian Army officered, by the most part, by British regulars, soldiers being Indians. Upton was incredibly racist toward the Indians. He doesn't have a lot of good things to say about Indians or about Indian culture. But he found the British officers led these Indian soldiers effectively, and they were solid units. And his read of history was that they performed very well in the Sepoy Rebellion, or the Sepoy Mutiny of only a few years before. And he wasn't wrong about that. My conclusion is that in that model, British regulars leading Indian soldiers, he was seeing U.S. Army regulars leading volunteers, leading average Americans come to battle when the time comes. He was also clearly influenced by what he saw in the Serbo-Turkish War, as he was in Germany. He came back intending to write this book, The Armies of Asia and Europe, and he intended that this book would conclude with a chapter on the follies of American military history. Well, that chapter just grew and grew and grew, and the book wasn't being published, and Sherman was, got to get it out, got to get the book out, crank the book out, get the book out. So finally, Upton decided to cut that chapter off. The book was published without the chapter on American military history. And Upton then continued work on what would become, get my clicker here, the military policy of the United States, which my understanding is, and no one's ever corrected me on this, this is probably the first serious effort to write a military history of the United States. Let me tell you, it's a screed. It is a screed. He is hypercritical of Congress. Everything that ever went wrong in any war was the fault of Congress, from the Continental Congress through the Congress of the Civil War. Whenever something goes wrong, it's Congress that screws it up. Generals seldom screw things up. So he's got a hyper-partisan point of view here, to be certain. But it's between these two books then, and this book never gets finished, more on that in a few. the military policy book, never actually gets finished. From these two books emanate his reforms. He wants to change the United States Army, wants to reform its structure because he thinks it's broken. And let me run down for you real quickly what those reforms were. There are two that kind of go hand in hand. One was he wanted to end lineal promotion. The second was he wanted to have a mandatory retirement. Now, for those of you who might not know what lineal promotion was, in the old Army, you were assigned to a regiment and you lived in that regiment. And as a lieutenant, you're assigned to that regiment, and you don't get promoted to captain unless two things happen. The first is that you're the senior most lieutenant. You gotta be the senior most lieutenant before you can become a captain. The second thing that happens is that the captain has to go away, either promoted, resigns, or dies. So you become a captain, and same thing until you become a major, same thing until you become a lieutenant colonel, same thing until you become a colonel. That meant that there were lieutenants that were in their 30s, captains that were in their 50s, majors and lieutenant colonels that were in their 60s, and regimental commanders that were in their 70s. So the end to lineal promotion was going to put an end to that. You could get promoted across regiments. It would be a promotion by merit, and mandatory retirement would end having 60-year-old geezers like me in U.S. Army regiments. He wanted to reform the staff. The Army staff was broken in any number of ways. He proposed reforming the Army staff. He wanted the Army to adapt something he called the National Volunteers, an organization that looks a lot like today's National Guard. He wanted to create a war college and a staff college. He wanted to strengthen the position of the commanding general of the Army. The commanding general historically was extremely weak in its dealings both with the staff and with the Secretary of War. The only strong commanding general, I think it's fair to say, in the history of that position was a guy named Grant, and it was a war that made him strong. Sherman complained incessantly about what a waste of oxygen it was for him to be the commanding general of the United States Army. All of these things eventually, except for the National Volunteers, all of these things became part of what was known as the Burnside Bill in 1879, and yes, it's that Burnside, which the Senate rejected, and it didn't become law. The charge of militarism comes out of several points here, but and because we're running a little bit short on time, I want to highlight what I think is the most important one. And that is his desire to reduce the power of the Secretary of War and to increase the power of the commanding general. And he wrote about this, and Weigley and Ambrose both pick up on this. It's kind of a cute passage. He's writing to one of his good friends, a gentleman named James Wilson, and he tells Wilson, quoting here, Sherman is accused of desiring to dwarf the secretary till he can, without inconvenience, carry him in his vest pocket. Confidentially, that's just where I'd like to see him. And so clearly this is a militarist. He's trying to reduce civilian authority, increase military authority. The problem with that is there's a context to what he's doing. And let me give you two contexts. One context is Reconstruction. And let me preface this by saying, Upton, given his background, a staunch abolitionist, thought that no punishment of the South could be too harsh. If anything, thought that Reconstruction was too soft on the South. So with that as a preface. He was appalled by the Reconstruction Acts. There were Reconstruction Acts of 1866, 67, 68. Put in sum total, they removed command of the Reconstruction Army from the President of the United States and put it in the hands of the Secretary of War. The President could no longer tell the Secretary what to do. And this is, if you're familiar with the history of this era, this is the genesis of Andrew Johnson's impeachment, because he tried to fire the Secretary of War as a way to get at things he didn't like. This appalled Upton that an appointed Secretary of War, as he put it, he now has the power of the purse and the power of the sword, could command an army where the elected commander-in-chief had lost control of that army. He thought this to be a horrific threat to a Republican democracy. It looked to him like militarism. The other, and there's lots more in the book about this, but the other piece of context that is fascinating to me is this book. I want to wander around, but I'm told I got to stay near the mic. I wander around my classrooms, drives my students nuts. The book was not finished on Upton's death. There were a couple copies of the manuscript floating around the Army. Officers were reading it. When Elihu Root became Secretary of War in the early 1900s with the mission of fixing the Army, which clearly was broken after the Spanish-American War, Army officers came up to him and said, have you ever read Armies of Asia and Europe? And no. Well, they gave him a copy. And have you heard about this? And they said no. And they gave him a handwritten copy of what Upton had done. He read both. He ordered the War Department to publish them. Hence, you can see these are, well, Appleton published this first. The War Department subsequently published again. War Department published this. Well, in putting this together, officers in the War Department took a look at this manuscript, and there were 4 chapters in the manuscript that they really didn't know what to do with. They looked odd to them. So they pulled them out. And so this book, as published, is missing 4 chapters that Upton wrote. One of them is on Virginia. One of them is on Confederate finances in 1862. One of them, the third one, I don't recall, I'm afraid to say. I'm sorry. The fourth one is this thing, and that is the chapter. That's the cover of it. The Civil and Military Policy of Rome. The really odd thing about this is that and you can see it's chapter 33. It's right in the middle of the Civil War. He gets it, but by the time he commits suicide, he's into late 1862. It's right in the middle of the Civil War where he puts this thing. And I'm sure that those Army officers came upon this and, what the hell is this doing here? This makes no sense. It's gone. So I went to the Army War College to do my research. There's a cache of Upton papers there, and among other things, this was here. And I read it, and it's not written in Upton's handwriting, so it's actually semi-legible. I read it, man, this makes no sense. And I made very few notes on it, and I went home. And about a year later, as I'm writing the chapter on the politics of reform, about the politics of the late 1870s, the light went on what this chapter was about. And I called up the guy at Carlisle Barracks and said, please make me a copy of this thing and ship it off to me. And he said, it's going to cost you, I think it was 70, 75 bucks. It wasn't cheap. I said, I don't care. I need it. I need it now. Please do it. And they sent it to me. Well, let me read to you, and it's a bit long, so bear with me, please. Let me read to you the passage where the light went off. So this is Upton. The Roman Republic, he wrote, possesses an interest civil as well as military. Forewarned is forearmed. Free people like the Romans admire heroism and love to reward military achievement. No monarch in Europe has today the power of an American president. With the consent of the Senate, from the Chief Justice down, he has the gift of more than 90,000 civil offices, any one of which, save in the judiciary, he can vacate and fill at pleasure. Ever since the acceptance of the pernicious maxim, to the victors belong the spoils, these offices, like so much gold, have been distributed by senators and representatives to the men who have been or may be most loyal to themselves and to the party. With the people thus accustomed to executive corruption, let us imagine, as under the Roman system, our president in uniform, booted and spurred, galloping from the White House to the camp, his military retinue swelled by senators and representatives, fawning for favor and scrambling for spoils. How long, it would be asked, would our liberties survive? To the historian from the example of Rome, he concluded, the historian from the example of Rome, he concluded, might not fix the exact duration of the Republic, but he could at least make one prophecy of speedy fulfillment. At the first meeting held at headquarters, the means would be discussed of prolonging the term of the president, if not the more startling proposition to declare him president for life. Ladies and gentlemen, he's writing about Ulysses S. Grant. When he was writing that chapter, you were in the last phases of the Hayes presidency. There were scandals across the country. It seemed to be falling apart. And there were, and this is what I found in my research in writing that chapter, there were articles across political journals around the country talking about Grant coming back for a third term. Some of the journals were critical of it. Some were very supportive of it. But there was a serious movement to get Grant to run for president again in 1880 because he would be the savior of the republic. That's what Upton is writing about there. If Upton were a militarist, none of that would bother him. But he had become convinced that Grant and the corruption of the Grant administration represented a serious problem for the American Republic. And hence he was a huge supporter of civil service reform, which was a big issue in the late 19th century. And finally, Upton knew what he knew, and the other aspect of his militarism allegedly was this national volunteers, the federal control of volunteers. Upton knew that worked. He knew that federal control of volunteers had worked because that's what had happened in the Civil War. He had led a regiment of green volunteers who became known. Their name across the Army of the Potomac was Upton's Regulars. The best regimental history of the 121st New York is entitled Upton's Regulars. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was then an officer serving on the staff in the Army of the Potomac, talked about Upton's Regulars in his diary and in his letters. He knew this worked. After the Civil War, he wrote to one of his officers who had attended with him a regimental reunion. He said, "When I saw the veterans, I had a right to feel proud. They had fought as few men had ever fought before to save their country and liberty." To then Representative James A. Garfield in 1878, and Garfield was one of the powerful forces behind Army reform. He wanted Upton's reforms enacted. He wrote Garfield, he said, "Whatever military record I have was won as a volunteer. And like all of our people, I believe in the future we shall have to look at volunteers whenever great emergencies arise. Only let us give them good organization and call them out for a period sufficiently long to enable them to become heroes like those at Vicksburg, Atlanta, Gettysburg, and Richmond." Now, my book goes into detail in other areas as well about his life, but the key point here is this misunderstood reformer. Last thing, and then I'll throw it open to questions. One of the things I learned from John early as a graduate student was you had to be able to explain why any of this is important. I think it was my first year, John. You were teaching your old War in the Modern World course, and he invited me to give a lecture. And at this point, I was a budding naval historian, and I still enjoy naval history. And so, I don't know if you recall, I chose to give a lecture on the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And when the lecture was over, John sat in the back of the classroom, about this size, a small auditorium. He says, "Dave, what's the importance of this battle? How does this change the course of the war? What's it all mean?" And I was kind of bumfuzzled because I really hadn't thought much about that. Well, so what's the importance of this? If I'm right and Weigley and Ambrose are wrong, what's the importance about this? Well, I mean, the first is, in this day and age, I think it's important to get history right. Even if it's not important, I think it's important to get it right. And I hope I've gotten it right. But beyond this, I will tell you that I was just, again, talking to John about this before this lecture. Over the last few years, I've come to realize, without I didn't set out to do this. I didn't set out to write a different view of Upton, to set out a completely different picture, but I did. But I think what I've also done here is I've changed the portrait of the United States Army in the late 19th century. The Russell, Weigley, Stephen Ambrose view of the Army, as reflected by their view of Upton, has permeated scholarship. And this biography of Upton is changing the way scholars of the 19th century Army and the early 20th century Army view that Army. It's changing it substantially. And that, I think, is why this biography matters. I thank you very much.
All right, so we're ready for questions, but we were thinking that we would try a new method with your sheets of paper. So if anybody needs a sheet of paper, we have some people who will help you, and then get them down here to me. All right, first question. What changed in his life that led to his suicide?
That's a really good question. It would appear, and here I have to give someone else credit. A team of Army doctors wrote an article, geez, at this point 20 years ago, I think, in the Journal of Military Medicine. And they went through his medical records, and they looked at, among other things, that wonderful handwriting and other pieces of evidence that presented themselves in letters he wrote or people wrote about him. And what they concluded was that he had a benign tumor growing between his brain and his nasal cavity that today is eminently operable, but at the time, no one had a clue what was going on. It probably started affecting him when he was the commandant of cadets at West Point, because he was having a hard time sleeping. He would see the doctors. He had constant headaches. By 1880, the pain was incessant. He couldn't sleep at night. He had a hard time concentrating. And this letter was written while he was on his honeymoon in Europe with his wife. So this letter, as bad as the handwriting is, was written in 1868. By 1880, 81, his handwriting it's just unimaginably bad. It's terrible. So there's all this evidence that this is going on in his head, and to get a measure for how much pain he was in, he was promoted to colonel and appointed colonel of the 4th Artillery in the late summer of 1880, and was assigned to go out to the Presidio right away. And he kept asking Sherman, who was still the commanding general of the Army, to delay his assignment. Is there a way he can stay in the Philadelphia area? Is there a way he can get assigned to Fort Hamilton in New York, which is on Staten Island? And what he didn't tell anybody was the reason he didn't want to go out to the West Coast is he was seeing I think what we would today call an eye, ears, nose, and throat specialist in Philadelphia, one of the nation's best, allegedly, and seeking treatment there. The treatment consisted of, well, the doctor diagnosed him as having a nasal catarrh, C-A-T-A-R-H, I believe. If you look that up, it's an inflammation of the mucous membranes. And the treatment, ready for this? The treatment was to put steel rods up in his mucous membranes, connect it to electrodes, and to burn the mucous membranes so that smoke is coming out of his nose. That seemed a good idea given the pain he was in. And he writes to both a sister and to, I want to say James Wilson, might have been DuPont, one of the two. And they both clearly have written him going, my God, you must be in great, this treatment must be horrible. And he, oh, no, really, it's really not painful at all. And I just, are you kidding me? So this is what he's living with. he gets assigned to the Presidio, and he, in March of 1881, he put a revolver to his head and pulled the trigger. And that seems to be the proximate cause. Now, what Weigley and Ambrose and others have said was he was depressed. He was depressed. He thought his tactics were a failure. He was depressed over his wife's death. I have no doubt that all of that was true, but that was made all the more powerful by the fact that he couldn't sleep at night. I mean, he was in immense physical pain.
All right, next question. What did Upton's leading military contemporaries, Sherman, Sheridan, Grant, etc., think of his 1870s, early 80s suggestions for reforming the U.S. Army?
I don't know what Grant thought of them. For the most part, Sheridan and Sherman were behind him. Now, when the Burnside bill, this bill that goes before Congress, which represented the bulk of Upton's ideas, there are a few missing. Sherman did an odd thing, but let's face it, Sherman was an odd guy. Sherman retreated from the debate. He did not enter into the debate. He did not use what could have been his considerable influence in Congress to move it along, and it's not clear why that was the case. But Sheridan wrote supportively of Upton's reforms, as did Sherman. And Sherman wrote a letter that shows up in the committee report supporting Upton's ideas, but he personally is uninvolved. So, but I can't speak to Grant. I will say, there were a couple of prominent officers from the Civil War who were against Upton's reforms. Among them, two people who, well, I won't go to the pejorative. John Pope and Irvin McDowell wrote not in support of Upton's reforms, not in support of the so-called Burnside bill. And the interesting thing is that they both decried their Prussian nature, and so that was a powerful thing there, without explaining what was Prussian about them. And again, there's not that much that was Prussian about them. There really wasn't.
All right, thank you. So the next one, a racist and yet fiercely anti-slavery. Is this a contradiction? And if so, what is the rationalization?
Well, I don't think it is a contradiction. One can see slavery as being wrong. It's wrong to own human beings. It's wrong to treat them as property. It's an affront to God. But racism is not necessarily equivalent to slavery. I mean, there's if you were my student, no. I mean, there are times in history where there have been slaves where race wasn't involved. There are times in history where there's racism without slavery. I don't think it is a contradiction. I just don't. Hard to explain, I guess. I'm sorry.
And also the impact of his proposed reform.
I should have covered that. So Congress rejects the Burnside bill in 1789. He continued to work on his manuscript, Military Policy. He continued to push for reform. What he came to the conclusion, and frankly, Sherman came to the same conclusion, and it makes all the sense in the world. Your bill is too darn big. It's too darn all-encompassing because it gives too many points of attack. Some people will hate this, and some people will hate that, and some people will hate this. Put together, they all hate the bill and they'll vote against it. So Upton, after the defeat of the Burnside bill, committed himself to working on one thing and getting it through, and that was mandatory retirement. That didn't happen before his death. And then Upton's ideas went away. And then the Spanish-American War happened, and the American Army performed really very poorly in it, and poorly because it was poorly planned. There was little staff, there was little thought, no logistical preparation. We won that war because we're fighting the Spanish. And had we been fighting any other major European power, we would have had our rear end handed to us. So when Teddy Roosevelt became president, he appointed his good friend Elihu Root to be the Secretary of War. And he told Root's major mission was to fix the Army. And so that's how Root got introduced to these books, is having been given the mission of fixing the Army. Have you read Upton? And Root took Upton's ideas and those of others. To be clear, there are other ideas floating through here, but he took Upton's ideas and those of others, and while Root was Secretary of War, 3 major bills passed Congress: the Militia Act of 1903, otherwise known as the Dick Act; the Militia Act of 1908, which actually passes after Root has left Secretary of War, but it really is a Root reform; the General Staff Act. All 3 of those bills heavily influenced by Upton's ideas. And then on top of that, Root ordered the creation of what will become the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And he turns what was known as the School of the Line, which was out at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, it gets turned into what will become the Command and General Staff College. And so he's very influential 20 years after his death, and the Army to this day is living with many of these Uptonian reforms, if it doesn't know it.
Are there any further questions? Okay, great. Well, thank you again, David.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
I hope you'll join us out in the lobby for some cookies. And unfortunately, Literati wasn't able to be here today, but we do have some book plates if you would like to have David sign those and order the book. So join us out in the lobby. Thank you.